Welcome to Tales from Sector 9, your portal to immersive sci-fi audio stories. If you enjoy deep space action, rogue AIs, and conspiracy theories, you're in the right place. Tap like and subscribe to keep the adventures coming. Drop a comment and tell us where in the galaxy you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and prepare for tonight's story. The Eighth Fleet. The first truth Ethan Ward had ever trusted absolutely was that patterns do not lie. People lie. Documents lie with breathtaking institutional fluency. Governments lie for generations, across administrations, across languages, across the careful silences of men who take their secrets into the ground with them. But patterns, the emergent shapes that rise unbidden from oceans of data, the geometry hiding inside a decade of procurement records that nobody was supposed to look at sideways. Patterns are the universe speaking in its native tongue. It was 3 minutes past midnight on a Tuesday in late January 2029 when the pattern found him. Ethan sat in the blue-white glow of 4 monitors in the second bedroom of his rented Arlington apartment, surrounded by the archaeology of his particular kind of obsession. Cold coffee, 3 empty glasses, a photograph of a man in navy dress whites whose face Ethan had studied so many times the details had worn grooves in his memory. The man was smiling. He had Ethan's jaw, or Ethan had his. The direction of inheritance was a matter of perspective, which time made increasingly academic. The work in front of him had started as contract fraud. A former colleague at DHS had flagged an anomaly in defence logistics billing. Standard enough, a shipment of aviation-grade hydraulic fluid billed to a vessel that appeared nowhere in the naval registry. Ethan had been doing this kind of forensic archaeology for 6 years, since the government career ended badly. He knew how to follow money the way a surgeon knows anatomy, not by thinking about it, but by feeling for the wrongness beneath the surface. The vessel was listed as USNS Horizon's Edge. No hull number, no port of registry, no construction record in the open databases, the closed ones he wasn't supposed to access, or the archived ones 3 administrative generations deep in the Naval History and Heritage Command's digitization backlog. But the bills kept arriving. Had kept arriving, he now discovered, since March of 1964. Hydraulic fluid, nitrogen gas, titanium fasteners, specialised electronics that hadn't existed commercially until the 1990s, yet here they were in 1978 procurement manifests, line items in budgets that had been folded inside 12 layers of aggregated programme spending, like a message inside a message inside a message. 65 years of supplies to a ship that did not exist. He began pulling personnel records the way you pull a thread from a sweater, carefully, knowing that the whole garment might unravel, accepting it. Officer promotions, 8th Fleet Command. Medal citations, 8th Fleet Command. Pension disbursements, 8th Fleet Command. Casualty notices, and there were hundreds of them, stretching back to the early years, names attached to dates and circumstances classified beyond any designation he had a clearance tier for, all bearing the same header. 8th Fleet Command, United States Navy. The US Navy had 7 numbered fleets. He knew this the way he knew his own shoe size. The 7th Fleet was based at Yokosuka. There was no 8th Fleet. Ethan Ward sat very still for approximately 90 seconds. Then he began to really dig. It was a database synchronization error that gave him the grandfather. A sloppy migration artifact, the kind that happened when legacy systems were folded into newer architecture. In this case, a 1991 digitization of personnel records being cross-referenced against a 2019 update of the same database, and for perhaps 40 minutes, somewhere in the handshake between 2 incompatible schemas, a portion of a record had been briefly and accidentally visible that was not supposed to be visible at all. He almost missed it. Ward, Marcus J. Commander, USN. Born September 14, 1931, Annapolis, Maryland. Assignment, 8th Fleet. Date of death. And here the record had been patched, stitched closed, the field replaced with the official version he had always known. February 17th, 1968. Engineering accident aboard USS Terrier, North Pacific. Except the synchronization error had lingered in a cache. The original record showed no date of death. Ethan looked at the photograph on his desk. His grandfather smiled back at him, patient as ever. He was still staring at it when every database connection he had dropped simultaneously. His VPN clients threw errors. His email client failed to authenticate. The bank of software he used to tunnel through archived government systems went dark one by one, like lights in a building where something has gone very wrong. He had time to copy exactly one file, a list of 47 names attached to 8th Fleet Command, his grandfather's among them, before the last session terminated. He had time after that to think. Someone noticed. Then the knock came. Lieutenant Taylor Roy was a young man with the flat, patient face of someone who had grown up knowing exactly what he was going to do with his life, and had been doing it efficiently ever since. He carried no weapon Ethan could see. He was accompanied by 2 others who remained in the hallway, and he entered Ethan's apartment without hostility, without theatre, and with an expression that suggested he had done this particular thing before and found it neither pleasant nor unpleasant. "Mr. Ward," he said, "you need to come with me." "Am I under arrest?" Roy considered the question with genuine seriousness. "Not technically." "That's an interesting word. Technically. We have about 11 minutes before this becomes significantly more complicated. I'd rather it didn't." They did not take him to a facility he recognised. The drive was 3 hours, southwest through darkness, past the ambient glow of the Capitol receding in the rear window, like a memory of the world Ethan already understood. He watched it go. Then there was a military installation in the Virginia mountains that his phone showed as empty hillside, and below it, or rather within it, something that felt less like a facility and more like a lung, enormous and working, full of people moving with the particular purpose of those who've been underground long enough that the sky has become theoretical. He was placed aboard an aircraft unlike any aircraft he could name. It climbed. It kept climbing. At some point, he was not certain when, because the viewport was covered and there was no physical sensation of transition, just a subtle wrongness in his inner ear and a quieting of all sound. He understood that the aircraft was no longer in an atmosphere. The station revealed itself the way a cathedral does when you approach it from the wrong angle. Gradually, incomprehensibly large, and then all at once. It had been built over decades and looked like it. Modules of different architectural eras bolted together with the functional inelegance of something that had grown rather than been designed. And yet the overall impression was of intention, of will, of a structure that knew what it was. Captain Beau Fleming met him at the docking collar. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with the kind of face that had weathered something real and kept the marks as a matter of honesty. He shook Ethan's hand with the grip of someone who had stopped performing social niceties about 15 years ago and now only expressed things he actually meant. "Welcome to the Meridian," Fleming said. "She's not much to look at from the outside." "She's extraordinary." Something moved across Fleming's face. Not pride exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something worn smooth by long familiarity. "Yeah," he said, "she is." Admiral Mason Coleman was waiting in a briefing room that looked out on a viewport Ethan could not stop looking at. Beyond the reinforced glass, the earth hung in the black like a lantern someone had hung at the end of a very long corridor, blue and patient and achingly familiar. Coleman was 61 years old and looked it, in the way that certain men look their age, not from deterioration but from accumulation, from the weight of everything they'd carried for a long time settling visibly into the architecture of their posture. "Sit down, Mr. Ward," he said. "This will take a while." It took 4 hours. The 8th Fleet had been commissioned in 1962, funded through a lattice of program budgets and misdirection, so elaborate it had taken the combined effort of 3 presidential administrations and 2 generations of comptrollers to maintain. Its founding premise was simple, in the way that the most world-altering ideas are always simple. A recovered artifact from a lunar impact site in 1957. Not a weapon, not a vehicle, but something that might be described as an archive, had contained enough, compressed technological information to accelerate human engineering by somewhere between 1 and 2 centuries. Dr. Evelyn Patterson had spent 9 years of her life extracting and interpreting fragments of it. She had died in 1983 without receiving public credit for any of what she'd accomplished, which included, in practical terms, the gravitic drives that had made the Meridian possible, the quantum-tunnelled communication network that kept the fleet's far-flung installations in contact, and the theoretical framework underlying most of what the Solar Commonwealth called advanced medicine, the Solar Commonwealth. Ethan sat with that phrase for a moment. 42 million people, Coleman told him. Lunar cities bored into ancient basalt, 6 million strong, lit by fusion light and breathing recycled air, and growing up with the Earth as a distant lantern in their windows that they regarded with the complicated love of descendants for a homeland they'd never visited. Martian settlements under domes that were becoming cities, that were becoming something harder to name, a culture, a sensibility, a way of being human that had diverged by 40 years of Martian winters and Martian distances and Martian pragmatism from anything Earth would easily recognise. Stations in the belt that felt like the age of sail transplanted to vacuum. A scientific enclave on Ganymede that had produced in relative anonymity discoveries that would have earned a dozen Nobel Prizes if they could have been published. The methane sky isolation of Titan. 42 million people who did not officially exist. "We kept it hidden," Coleman said, "because the alternative was exposure, and exposure meant panic. Panic meant the end of the program before it had established itself securely enough to survive public scrutiny." "And now?" Ethan asked. Coleman looked out at the Earth for a long moment. "Now we have a different problem. Commander David Wright was the fleet's intelligence chief, and the closest thing to a historian that the fleet possessed. He had spent his career cataloguing things the rest of the world was not supposed to know, and it had given him the particular quality of a man who'd been carrying a great weight for so long that he'd forgotten he was carrying it, until someone asked him to set it down and he couldn't. He showed Ethan the footage in a small room with no viewport. He said it was better that way. The first contact had occurred in 1971. The details were classified beyond even what Coleman had shown him, but the shape of it was clear. A fleet patrol vessel near Jupiter's outer system had detected anomalous objects and gone to investigate. What had been sent back, before the vessel stopped transmitting, had been enough to establish that humanity was not the only intelligence in the solar neighbourhood, and that the other intelligence had opinions about humanity's expansion that were not ambivalent. The silent ones. Wright had spent decades studying the communications the fleet had intercepted and partially decoded. He was not a fearful man, Ethan thought, but the particular stillness that came over him when he spoke about what the communication suggested was something Ethan had no frame for. "They're not malicious," Wright said. "That would almost be reassuring. Malice implies that you matter to them as an enemy. What we believe they feel about us is closer to..." He searched for the word with the care of a man who understood that the wrong word would be a lie, and Wright, whatever else he was not a liar. "Necessity," he finally said. "They view emerging civilizations the way an ecosystem views an invasive species, not with hatred, with the clean certainty that something must be done. How long have you known they were coming back? Long-range signatures in the outer system. 8 months. Wright paused. We've been trying to decide how to tell the Earth. Ethan thought about 42 million people living in the dark, defended by a fleet that the 10 billion people below didn't know existed, from an enemy the universe hadn't bothered to confirm was real until now. He thought about his grandfather smiling in dress whites, assigned to a fleet that didn't officially exist, dying in an accident that turned out not to have happened, leaving behind a grandson who grew up in the particular shape that absence makes. He thought, I was always going to find this. Then he did. Something reckless. He transmitted everything he had. He used a terminal he'd been given access to. Roy had stopped being his jailer sometime in the 3rd hour and had quietly become something closer to an ally. And he sent a compressed file to 4 separate civilian nodes, each of them journalists he trusted in the way you trust tools you've used for a long time, knowing their limits and working within them. He included the procurement records, the personnel files, the evidence of 65 years of hidden expenditure, the redacted and unredacted versions of his grandfather's service records side by side. He sent it before Fleming found him at the terminal. Fleming didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Do you understand what you may have just done?" "Someone had to decide," Ethan said. "Not you," Fleming said. "Not yet." 3 hours later, Dr. Naomi Patel appeared on the bridge with a look on her face that Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. Not fear exactly, but its more professional sibling. The expression of a scientist confronting data that the available models cannot accommodate. "Long-range sensors," she said, "the outer system." She showed them the feed. Thousands of objects, moving with a velocity that implied a propulsion concept the fleet had never successfully reverse-engineered from the captured communications, which meant it was better than anything the fleet possessed. Moving with a coherence that was not the coherence of a debris field or a natural phenomenon. Moving with the implacable, unhurried certainty of something that had done this before and had never had reason to doubt the outcome. Coleman looked at the display for a long time without speaking. "General quarters," he said. Callisto was gone in 11 hours. The colony on Callisto had been the fleet's oldest outer system installation. 300,000 people in caverns beneath the ice. A city that had been growing quietly since 1978, that had produced engineers and physicians and poets and children who had never seen a sky without a ceiling. Fleming's task force reached the engagement zone too late and fought anyway, and Ethan, watching the tactical feed from the bridge, understood for the first time the burden that military officers carry. The live feed of catastrophe narrowing to numbers, to vectors, to the distance between what you could do and what was happening, and the physical sensation of that gap as something close to grief. Fleming watched the evacuation transports fail to clear the engagement envelope one by one. His face did not change. That was the worst of it. The fleet lost 41 vessels in the first engagement. The enemy lost none. Director Harold Page arrived by secure transmission from Earth 18 hours later, his face on the briefing room screen carrying the specific expression of a man who has believed for 30 years that he was protecting civilization and has just been informed that civilization has been lost before the enemy even arrived. "You transmitted classified information to the public network," Page said. He was addressing Ethan. "Do you have any conception of the damage you've caused?" "The damage," Ethan said, "is in progress. It was in progress before I transmitted anything." "The panic alone will, Director." Ethan leaned forward. "There are 42 million people beyond Earth's atmosphere right now who have been defending 10 billion people who didn't know they existed. Callisto just lost 300,000 of them. How long were you planning to keep that from us?" Page's face did something complicated. "Until the crisis was resolved. That's what every custodian of every secret in history has said. And sometimes they were right. Not this time. Evelyn Cross was the fleet's archivist. She'd spent 30 years cataloguing everything the founders had left behind, and she found Ethan in the archive room at 0200 ship time, alone with his grandfather's journals, physical journals, handwritten, the covers worn soft as skin by handling, because Roy had cleared the access and somehow understood that this was what Ethan needed. He'd been reading for an hour when Cross sat down across from him. "There's something in the early records I want you to look at," she said. She had the specific quietness of someone who has lived among documents long enough to understand that the most important information is always the thing that looks like administrative record keeping. Dr. Patterson's final project. The founders knew this day might come. They planned for it. The defence network had been designed in 1976 and built over the following 12 years at a cost that appeared in no single budget but in dozens of them, spread across programs dedicated to communication infrastructure, navigation beacons, deep space survey platforms, gravitational interference platforms, in the language of the original blueprints, devices that could, in theory, create localized gravity wells sufficient to strip velocity from any object not specifically shielded against them, which the current enemy's vessels, based on the captured physics Wright had spent his career studying, were not. The problem was activation. The network required a simultaneous trigger signal, a cryptographic key distributed across the entire activation sequence, and the activation sequence was buried in 67 years of fleet administrative records. Not hidden in them, was them. The entire bureaucratic history of the Eighth Fleet, the procurement manifests, the personnel records, the medal citations, the casualty notices, the pension payments, was the key. Patterson had built her encryption into the institution itself. No single person could hold all of it. No single database contained it. It required someone who could read the whole pattern. Ethan looked at Evelyn Cross for a long moment. "She designed this for someone like me," he said. "I believe," Cross said carefully, "she designed it for you, or someone like you. She couldn't know your name, but she knew the type. Someone on the outside, someone who followed the thread all the way to the end." He worked for 19 hours straight. Roy brought him coffee at regular intervals and said nothing, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done. Fleming stopped by twice and stood in the doorway looking at the screens with an expression Ethan couldn't read until the second time, when he understood that it was hope, carefully managed, rationed like oxygen on a ship that isn't sure how long the journey is. The key assembled itself from the pattern, the way all patterns ultimately reveal themselves, not as a single revelation, but as a series of smaller ones that retrospectively showed they'd been pointing at the same thing all along. 67 years of institutional memory, encrypted in the boring language of logistics and administration, by a woman who had understood that the future would need it, and had hidden it in plain sight because the most effective concealment is always the thing that looks like nothing important. At hour 19, the activation signal was ready. Page transmitted his objection at 0800, and Coleman overrode it at 0801 hours. "Humanity isn't ready," Page said, and he had the decency to sound genuinely anguished about it, which Ethan acknowledged was something. He was not an evil man. He was a frightened man, and frightened men who have been given power over secrets develop a specific theology of concealment that they mistake after long enough for wisdom. "It never will be," Ethan said. "That's not how it works. You don't get ready for the thing and then face it. You face it, and that's how you get ready." He broadcast everything simultaneously. The public transmission routed through every fleet communication node, every civilian relay satellite, every signal that had been carefully partitioned from public knowledge for 6 decades. Lunar cities, Martian settlements, the belt, the fleet of warships that were, at this moment, engaging the silent ones in the outer approaches of the inner system, 300 kilometers above the surface of an Earth that was just waking up to find its sky full of things it hadn't known were there. He activated the network immediately after. The gravitational platforms had been dormant for 40 years. They powered up across 11 minutes, from the inner belt to the Jovian approaches, a distributed system that Patterson had designed with the quiet confidence of someone who had understood the physics well enough to trust them to wait. The activation cascade moved outward at the speed of light. By the time it reached the outermost platforms, the engagement had already entered its terminal phase, and what happened next was not exactly a battle. It was more like a demonstration, the invading, fleet fractured, not destroyed. The platforms weren't weapons in any conventional sense. They were simply physics applied to a specific vulnerability, and the effect was the effect you would expect when you redirect the gravitational coherence that an advanced vessel needs to maintain its drive geometry. They stopped. Some of them tumbled. Most of them retreated. They retreated with the unhurried certainty of something that has decided that the assessment requires revision. Admiral Mason Coleman, aboard the Meridian, with the Earth below him and the remnants of his fleet around him, and 41 crews unaccounted for, and a civilization that had spent its entire existence hidden now visible to every sensor humanity possessed, said into the open channel, "This is 8th Fleet Command. All stations, stand down from general quarters. Secondary units, begin search and rescue operations across all engagement zones. Earth stations, please be advised, we're your neighbours. We have always been your neighbours. We're glad you finally know." The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then every communication channel the fleet possessed lit simultaneously, which Coleman would later describe as the most chaotic and the most beautiful sound he had ever heard in 61 years of life, because it was the sound of a civilization talking to itself for the first time and discovering how large it had become without noticing. Months passed. The history of humanity was not rewritten. It was expanded, the way a map expands when the explorers come back, not invalidating what was known before, but revealing how much of the territory had been left blank, how many of the confident coastlines had been guesses. Schools revised their curricula, governments negotiated with entities they hadn't known existed. The Solar Commonwealth and the nation-states of Earth began the long, strange, necessary work of figuring out what they were to each other, which was something for which there was no precedent and no instruction manual, and which was therefore being conducted with the particular mixture of good faith and fumbling that characterized humanity at its most earnest. Ethan Ward flew to the moon in March. The memorial was below the surface, in a cavern lit by indirect fusion light that gave the stone walls the warm, amber quality of late afternoon, which was, he'd been told, intentional. Someone in the early years had insisted that a place of remembrance should not feel like a facility, and the decision had held for 60 years. The names were engraved in reflective alloy and ran from floor to ceiling along 3 walls of the chamber, tens of thousands of them, and each one had a date and a designation, and in many cases a notation that was simply a coordinate, a place in the solar system where the person had been when the account was finally settled. He found his grandfather's name on the eastern wall, near the base, where the earliest entries were. Ward, Marcus J., Commander USN. The date of death field was blank. The coordinate notation was a set of numbers he recognized as Kuiper Belt object designations, far past Neptune, far past the edge of anything the fleet had formerly charted. He stood in front of it for a long time. His terminal chimed. The transmission origin was logged as a deep space relay operating outside the formal fleet network, the signal propagating inward from somewhere past the 50 astronomical unit marker, which meant it had been in transit for nearly 7 hours. The encryption scheme was one he recognized because he had spent 19 hours reading the institutional records of the man who had helped design it 60 years ago, before Ethan had been born, before Ethan's father had been born, in a time when the solar system had still been a frontier and a man in a navy uniform had looked at that frontier and understood what it was going to cost. One sentence. "Tell your grandmother I kept my promise. I'll be home soon." Ethan Ward read it twice. He looked up at the name on the wall. He looked at the blank date field. He thought about the thing that Wright had said about the retreating fleet, that it was moving with the unhurried certainty of something that had decided the assessment required revision. And he thought about what that meant, what it implied about what was still out there, what was coming, what the gravitational platforms and the dead heroism of 41 lost ships and the 9-year labour of a woman named Patterson had bought them. Time, not safety, not victory, not the end of anything, just time. He typed a reply and watched it queue for transmission. It would arrive where it was going in approximately 7 hours. He didn't know what he'd say when the response came back. What you say to someone who has been gone since before you were born and was not as gone as everyone believed, who had apparently been out past the edge of the known solar system, doing something that had not been in any of the records he'd read, in service of a war that was not over, was only between phases, was a thing the scale of which humanity was still assembling the cognitive vocabulary to describe. He thought, "I come from a family of people who follow the pattern all the way to the end." He thought, that was always going to be a problem. He thought, good. Outside the memorial, in the amber-lit corridor that curved toward the transit hub and the ascending trains that ran to the surface and the stars, the Solar Commonwealth continued the improbable business of learning what it was. Children on Mars who had never seen an open sky were watching feeds of Earth's oceans with the reverent attention of people beholding myth made physical. Engineers in the belt were cross-referencing their atmospheric processing techniques with lunar environmental engineers, finding solutions that neither community had been able to reach alone. In briefing rooms across the inner system, fleet intelligence analysts were running the retreating enemy fleet's vector projections backward and forward and arriving at numbers that were not reassuring and were not shared widely, not because anyone had decided to hide them, but because the vocabulary for discussing them was still being constructed. Coleman had been right about one thing, Ethan thought. The Eighth Fleet would cease to be myth and become bureaucracy. That was the price of existing in the light. You traded the romance of the hidden for the friction of the real, and the friction of the real was how things actually got built. His grandfather was somewhere past the 50 astronomical units line in the dark between star systems, doing something Ethan didn't yet know, and would probably spend the rest of his life trying to understand. He walked toward the transit hub. The first war had been a reconnaissance mission. The next one would be the real assessment. He had approximately 7 hours to start preparing. The force that had attacked was not an invasion fleet. It was a scouting element, less than 1% of the Silent One's confirmed military capacity. The war that most of humanity had just finished watching in real time was a test. They had failed. They had also barely passed. What that meant in the cold mathematics of an intelligence that operated on geological timescales and viewed emerging civilizations as a systemic management problem was that the revision of the assessment would be thorough. It would also not be quick. Humanity had bought time. It had bought it at enormous cost. Whether it would spend that time wisely was the oldest open question in the history of the species, and nothing that had happened, not the colonies, not the fleet, not the gravity platforms, not the transmission from beyond the edge of the map, had yet answered it. Ethan Ward, who had spent his entire adult life following patterns to their end, boarded the train to the surface of the moon and looked out the window as the stone gave way to regolith, and the regolith gave way to the black sky above the crater rim, and thought, for the first time in his life, not about what was true. He thought about what to do with the truth now that he had it. That he was beginning to understand was the harder question. It had always been the harder question. It just had never been his to answer before.